The city of Chicago rose like a cathedral of glass and steel, its skyline glittering with ambition and history. From the 68th floor of the Colson Tower, Nathaniel Cole stood at the edge of his office, back to the world, gaze fixed on the icy stretch of Lake Michigan. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, but the storm brewing within him had nothing to do with the weather. Nathaniel had built his empire by refusing to make the same mistakes as the men who came before him, where others had collapsed. Under pressure or emotion, he thrived in detachment. Business wasn't just a profession to him, it was a battlefield, and he had long since learned that caring was a liability. He had made a choice 2 decades ago, one so absolute it felt like a second birth. He would never love again. Not after the woman who once claimed to love him had used his heart as a weapon, had turned his vulnerability into a transaction, had left him with nothing but shame and scorched memory. From that wreckage, Nathaniel emerged transformed. No handshakes, no flirtation, no intimacy. He became a fortress in a world full of fractures, and he liked it that way. Until today. On the mahogany table between him and his general counsel lay a contract that would change everything. It was the result of months of negotiation between his company, Coltech Innovations, and Ramirez Global Lines, an international shipping conglomerate with aging infrastructure but unrivaled maritime access. The merger was brilliant, strategic, unassailable on paper. But it came with one contingency that only 2 people in the world fully understood: a marriage. Across the room, Elena Ramirez reviewed the final page of the agreement with the poise of someone who had been raised to control a room. At 32, she was already a name spoken with either admiration or caution in high-level legal circles. Her reputation as a no-nonsense negotiator had spread far beyond her family name. She had her father's spine, her mother's eyes, and none of their romantic delusions. It was Elena who proposed the clause. A marriage, not for sentiment, but for optics. Investors preferred mergers with personal buy-in. Public trust rose when CEOs showed human stakes in success. It wasn't love that built empires. It was illusion, well managed. Nathaniel hadn't said yes at first. He had stared at the clause for days, dissecting every line, every possible breach, but the numbers didn't lie. The merger would double market access, expand technology licensing, secure their dominance for a generation. And this woman, this Elena, was no stranger to keeping her heart locked behind iron gates. She didn't wear her ambition like perfume. She wore it like armor. He admired that. Too much, perhaps. "This is the final version," she said, sliding the document across the table. "I made one change to clause 17. If either party wishes to exit the agreement before the 2-year term, it must be done with unanimous board consent. I don't like sudden endings." He picked up the pen. "Neither do I." Their eyes met. Not for long, but long enough. There was no ceremony, no glasses raised, no congratulations. Just 2 signatures and a silence so sharp it could cut glass. Nathaniel rose first, his posture regal. "Your legal team will receive copies within the hour." Elena nodded, her voice even. "My PR lead will coordinate the announcement. We'll say it was sudden but expected, an efficient match." He hesitated before speaking again. "Do you believe in love, Elena?" She gave a low, tired laugh. One, not aimed at him, but at some memory too far gone to matter. "I believe in loyalty, in necessity, in execution." She stepped forward, extending her hand. "I believe this will work, because it has to." He didn't take her hand. He hadn't touched anyone in years. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let it hover for a moment, then slowly withdrew it with a nod. "That's fine," she said. "I don't believe in fairy tales." As she turned to leave, her scent followed her, subtle, citrus and cedar, practical, unsentimental. But Nathaniel still stood there after the door clicked shut, wondering why that scent lingered like a memory he hadn't yet made. They met again 2 days later for the first press shoot. The venue was a quiet rooftop greenhouse above the Colson building, chosen for its skyline backdrop and curated image of private romance. She wore navy, not white. He wore a gray suit with a darker tie. Together, they looked like the closing argument of a billion-dollar courtroom drama. The photographer asked them to stand closer. They did. "Can you put your hand on her waist?" the assistant asked. "No," Nathaniel replied, voice sharp. Elena said nothing, but she turned just slightly toward him and whispered, "It's fine." We can stage it. I've posed for worse. His jaw clenched. The camera clicked. The lights flashed, their expressions stone and steel. That night, they sat at opposite ends of a long dining table in their penthouse suite. This wasn't part of my plan, she said as she swirled the wine in her glass, her voice measured. Nathaniel watched her, arms crossed. The plan is why it'll work. Do you always believe what you sign? Always. She gave a small smile then. You must have signed some terrible things. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the contract again. Now framed, in glass and hung above the bar like a trophy. Marriage, merged assets, coordinated appearances, separate bedrooms, no intimacy, no love, they had agreed. They had written it. But Nathaniel found himself replaying the exact moment her hand had hovered in the air, the moment she had let it fall, not because she was offended, but because she understood, because maybe she'd made a vow too. Later that night, he stood alone in the hallway, the soft sound of Elena's footsteps fading into the wing of the suite that wasn't his. He pressed his hand briefly against the wall between them and wondered not for the first time why it felt thinner than stone should. The wedding was unlike any fairy tale. No soft music, no trembling vows whispered under candlelight. Instead, the ceremony unfolded beneath the arched glass dome of the Chicago Cultural Center, an opulent space filled with business tycoons, reporters, legal sharks, and tech investors. It was less a celebration of love and more a convergence of power. Elena Ramirez stood motionless before the mosaic-tiled altar in an ivory silk gown, custom-designed but devoid of lace or softness, chosen as much for elegance as for practicality. It was the kind of dress that said, "This isn't a beginning, it's a merger." Nathaniel Cole waited at the end of the aisle like a monarch at the edge of his territory. He wore black on black, classic, uncompromising, and the look in his eyes was as unreadable as ever. They didn't exchange glances as Elena took her father's arm and began the slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. Her heels echoed against marble with the rhythm of a legal gavel striking finality. The audience didn't stand for romance. They stood because protocol demanded it. Nathaniel didn't smile when she reached him. Elena didn't expect him to. She hadn't seen him smile once in the weeks since their agreement. That perhaps was why she was drawn to the challenge. She had danced around closed men her whole life. Judges, executives, clients, but never one who carried silence like a religion. The officiant, a family friend of the Ramirez's and a former federal judge, kept it short. No dearly beloved. No talk of soulmates. Just the dry cadence of contract terms repackaged as marital vows. Do you, Nathaniel Cole, agree to honor this partnership with mutual respect, privacy, and discretion? I do. And do you, Elena Ramirez, agree to uphold this commitment with professional integrity, clarity of purpose, and equal benefit? I do. The rings were passed from a velvet box. White gold for him, platinum for her. Chosen by assistants and approved by brand managers. Nathaniel slipped the ring on her finger with the care of someone finalizing an acquisition. When her turn came, her hands were steady. She didn't falter, not even once. You may now complete the formal agreement. There was no kiss. Instead, they turned toward the crowd and nodded slightly, as if closing a deal over a boardroom table. Applause rose politely, respectful, restrained, entirely unsentimental. The reception was held at the Four Seasons, a short drive away where champagne flowed not for joy but for photos. Elena moved from guest to guest with the ease of someone who'd been groomed for diplomacy. She spoke in 3 languages. She answered questions about economic forecasts, offshore portfolios, and international trade deals. No one asked how she felt. No one cared. Nathaniel shadowed her like a storm cloud, close enough for optics, distant enough for silence. When they danced, it was for precisely 3 minutes and 20 seconds, long enough to satisfy the cameras. You look sharp, he said during the first dance, the compliment strange on his tongue. She raised an eyebrow. Sharp? Polished, he added, though the word didn't help. Elena laughed, not out of amusement, but out of the absurdity of it all. You should try that again sometime, with someone who needs the flattery. You don't? I don't need it, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't want it. The way she said it stopped him cold. They danced in silence after that, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, his palm hovering respectfully at her waist. To the onlookers, they looked perfect, composed, symmetrical, destined for headlines. By the end of the night, Nathaniel had disappeared. She found him later on the rooftop terrace, standing at the edge, jacket off, collar loosened, staring down at the river like it might answer the questions he couldn't ask. "Why are you up here?" she said. "I don't like endings," he replied. "Not even strategic ones." "Is that what this is to you? An ending?" "It's the end of something," he murmured. "I just haven't decided what yet." Elena walked toward him, her gown trailing behind her in a whisper of silk. The wind was cold but not unkind. "Don't pretend like you regret it," she said. "We both know how much we gain. That doesn't mean I have to enjoy it. Enjoyment wasn't in the contract." He turned to her then, eyes catching hers for longer than comfort allowed. Neither was this. There was no kiss, just silence. Just breath shared between two people who hadn't wanted love and found something more complicated. They returned to the penthouse with the efficiency of trained professionals. She went to her wing. He went to his. Their luggage had been unpacked by staff. Their separate bedrooms prepared to perfection. But that night, Elena stood at her window and found herself watching the lights of Chicago flicker across the lake. And she wondered, not for the first time, if this partnership would really stay, as simple as they wanted it to be. In the days that followed, structure replaced speculation. A joint calendar was set, outlining appearances, charity events, quarterly reviews. Her face was added to Coltech's Meet the Executive Family webpage. His was placed alongside Ramirez Global's rebrand. Their alliance was praised in the Forbes, dissected in the Atlantic, and glamorized on gossip sites. Publicly, they were magnetic. Privately, they were ghosts passing through the same rooms. And yet, there were cracks. He started to leave her handwritten notes beside the espresso machine. Just small things. Meeting times. A suggestion for a museum exhibit. A clipped article she'd find interesting. She in turn began stocking the wine fridge with his preferred Syrah from Napa and moved her office hours to overlap with his. They never discussed these accommodations, but neither denied them. One night, nearly a month after the wedding, they found themselves in the library, he reading a quarterly forecast, she preparing her arguments for a Supreme Court appeal. It was nearly midnight. Snow had started to fall, blanketing the city in ghostlight. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly, eyes still on her notes. "Miss what?" "Believing in something softer than power." He didn't answer. When she looked up, she found him staring at her. Not the way a man looks at a colleague or a wife of convenience, but like he was seeing her for the first time. "I used to believe in permanence," he said finally. "That things could last. That people wouldn't leave. When it mattered." "Someone did?" "She didn't leave. She stayed long enough to destroy everything first." The pain in his voice was quiet but volcanic. Elena knew the tone well. She'd used it herself once upon a time when she'd spoken about her mother's last days, her father's distant love. "You think I'm here to do the same?" she said. "I think I don't know what you're here for." That made her pause. "I'm here because I chose to be," she said simply. "And because despite everything we both swore off, something about this works." He looked down at his hands, the ones that had once held dreams and now held nothing but control. "Do you think we could ever make it real?" The question hung in the air like static. Elena didn't answer. Instead, she closed her laptop, walked to him, and placed a hand over his. For a long moment, they just sat like that. No strategy, no contract, no agenda. Just two people pretending not to feel what they were beginning to fear might be inevitable. And when she left the room, she didn't look back, because real or not, something had started that night. Something neither of them had the words or the courage to stop. The Chicago skyline shimmered under a canopy of stars, the city lights casting a golden hue over the icy waters of Lake Michigan. Inside the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, the atmosphere was equally luminous, albeit charged with an undercurrent of tension and unspoken emotions. Nathaniel Cole stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette outlined against the cityscape. The glass of scotch in his hand remained untouched, the amber liquid catching the light as he swirled it absent-mindedly. His mind, however, was far from the view before him. Elena Ramirez entered the room, her presence as commanding as ever. Dressed in a sleek black evening gown, she exuded confidence and poise. Yet there was a softness in her eyes, a vulnerability that belied her composed exterior. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice breaking the silence. He turned to face her, his gaze meeting hers. "Elena," he replied, his tone neutral yet tinged with something deeper. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their unspoken thoughts hanging heavily between them. I've been thinking, Elena began, choosing her words carefully. About us, about this arrangement. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Go on. She took a step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. We entered this marriage as a business deal, a strategic alliance. But lately, I've been questioning whether that's all it is. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. And what conclusion have you reached? Elena hesitated, then spoke with conviction. I don't know, but I do know that something has changed between us. He nodded slowly, acknowledging her words. I felt it too. They stood there, the distance between them narrowing, both physically and emotionally. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension palpable. Without another word, Nathaniel closed the gap between them, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as she savored the moment. Their lips met in a tender kiss, a culmination of weeks of suppressed emotions and unacknowledged desires. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of vulnerability, of a connection that neither had anticipated. As they pulled apart, their foreheads resting against each other, Elena whispered, "What are we doing?" Nathaniel's voice was barely audible. Something real. They spent the night together, not as business partners or strategic allies, but as two people exploring the depths of their connection. It was a night filled with passion, vulnerability, and a newfound intimacy that neither had expected. The following morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows, they sat together in the kitchen, sipping coffee in comfortable silence. Elena broke the silence. We need to talk about what this means. Nathaniel nodded. Agreed. They spent the day discussing their feelings, their fears, and the implications of their evolving relationship. It was a conversation marked by honesty and a willingness to confront the complexities of their situation. In the days that followed, they navigated the delicate balance between their public personas and their private relationship. They continued to attend events and meetings together, maintaining the facade of a strategic partnership. But behind closed doors, they explored the depths of their connection, building a foundation based on trust, vulnerability, and mutual respect. Their relationship was no longer defined by contracts or business deals. It had evolved into something deeper, something more meaningful. As they stood together on the balcony one evening, overlooking the city that had been the backdrop to their journey, Elena turned to Nathaniel. "Do you believe in love now?" she asked, a playful smile on her lips. He looked at her, his eyes filled with affection. "I believe in us." They shared a tender kiss, the city lights twinkling around them, a testament to the unexpected beauty of their journey. The following morning, Elena awoke before sunrise, wrapped not just in the warmth of Egyptian cotton sheets, but in something far more dangerous: clarity. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm of Nathaniel's breathing in the next room, separated by a wall and a contract that now felt increasingly irrelevant. She thought of his hands on her, not just in passion, but in gentleness, how he had touched her like someone who didn't know he was still capable of tenderness. Downstairs, the penthouse slowly filled with the aroma of Colombian roast, her preferred morning indulgence. When she entered the kitchen, Nathaniel was already there, shirt sleeves rolled, reading the morning headlines from his tablet. It was a habit she had quickly come to anticipate. He didn't look up as he spoke. "You were up late." "So were you," she replied, pouring her coffee. Their eyes met then. It was a brief, unspoken exchange that made her chest tighten, a confirmation that neither of them had slept well and that both knew exactly why. The mood between them shifted as the day progressed. They weren't lovers in public, nor strangers. They were becoming something else, something undefined. During their morning briefing, Elena leaned over to clarify a point on a merger draft and caught Nathaniel's scent: cedar, leather, and something warmer beneath it. He stiffened slightly but didn't pull away. She felt the current then, low and persistent, the constant thrum of what had not been said since that night. That evening, the press would expect them at the annual Innovation Gala, hosted at the Chicago Institute of Design and Technology. The event was, for most, a glittering affair of artificial charm and economic boasts disguised as speeches. But this year, they would attend as husband and wife, the city's most whispered about power couple. Elena's gown shimmered like starlight, silver with a plunging back and an architectural silhouette that echoed the city skyline. When she entered the foyer, Nathaniel's gaze found her instantly. He was dressed in a midnight black tuxedo with subtle satin lapels, a timeless elegance that only made his expression, genuine quiet awe, more powerful. "You clean up well," she teased, standing before him. "You look like a war I want to lose," he said almost too softly. Her smile faltered. She had been expecting the usual, his sardonic wit or stoic silence. But that, whatever that was, felt dangerously close to real. The gala unfolded like a symphony of false intimacy and forced applause. Between flutes of champagne and curated photo ops, Elena and Nathaniel danced once. A slow waltz under a glass dome as reporters whispered from a distance. "How long do you think we can keep pretending?" she asked, barely above a whisper. His hand tightened on her waist. "That depends. Which part are we pretending?" Their movements were synchronized, flawless. But beneath the polish she could feel his pulse, steady but quickening. Hers matched it. "The part where we're only business partners," she said. Nathaniel leaned closer, his breath brushing her temple. "We stopped being that the night. You touched me like I wasn't broken." She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. "And I stopped being just your wife on paper the night you let me see the man behind the empire." They said nothing more. They didn't have to. Every look, every measured breath between them carried volumes. Later that night, as the city dimmed and the gala faded into memory, they returned to the penthouse in silence. Elena unzipped her gown in her dressing room and paused, her bare back, catching a chill from the open window. She thought he had gone to bed. But when she turned around, Nathaniel stood in the doorway, eyes heavy with exhaustion and something else, hesitation. "I couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I." He walked toward her slowly, stopping just close enough to brush his fingers over her shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Regret what?" "This marriage, this transformation." He shook his head. "I regret not starting this version of it sooner." Eleanor's breath caught. It was the first time he had framed their union as anything but contractual, and it was the first time he'd implied wanting more than the illusion. "I'm still afraid," she admitted, "but not of failing, of wanting something that might never last." Nathaniel cupped her face with both hands, thumbs brushing the curve of her jaw. "If this burns out tomorrow, I'll still be grateful for every second we pretended not to be afraid." "No pretending anymore," she whispered. That night their intimacy was slower, not urgent, not desperate. It was reverent, intentional. A claiming not of bodies but of trust. In the days that followed, subtle changes emerged. Nathaniel began walking Elena to her car when she left for the firm. She began texting him articles she thought he'd enjoy. He started using her name in meetings instead of "my wife." And she noticed how he softened slightly when she entered a room. Their PR team remained oblivious, attributing their increasing comfort to media training. But they knew better. Their marriage was still a stage, yes, but the performances were no longer fiction. Late one evening, after a long day of boardroom politics and shareholder drama, Elena found herself in Nathaniel's office. The fire crackled behind him, casting shadows across the wall. She approached his desk with something in her hand. A simple envelope. He looked up. "What's that?" She placed it before him. "A letter I wrote to myself years ago. Before I gave up on love." He stared at it for a moment before lifting the flap and pulling out a folded piece of paper. As he read, she stood quietly, letting silence surround them. When he finished, he didn't speak. He rose from his chair, walked around the desk, and pulled her into his arms. "You still believe in this?" he asked. "I believe in you," she said. "And maybe that's enough." For a long time, neither of them moved. Outside, snow fell, in soft waves against the windows. Inside, two people, once frozen by past betrayals, stood at the edge of something terrifying and beautiful. They didn't say the word love. Not yet, but in that moment, they both felt it. And for the first time. Since their wedding, the walls didn't feel so high. The contract didn't feel so binding. And the distance between what they were and what they could be no longer felt impossible. It felt inevitable. The days that followed were a delicate dance of proximity and distance. Nathaniel and Elena found themselves navigating a labyrinth of emotions, each step forward met with a cautious retreat. The walls they had meticulously built around their hearts began to show cracks, revealing glimpses of vulnerability they had long suppressed. One evening, as the city lights shimmered below, Elena stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Nathaniel joined her, a glass of scotch in hand. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Do you ever wonder what this could have been if we had met under different circumstances? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink, contemplating her question. I used to believe that timing was everything, that the right person at the wrong time was still the wrong person. But now I'm not so sure. Elena turned to face him, her eyes searching his. What changed? You, he admitted. You made me question everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about myself. Their gazes locked, the intensity of their emotions palpable. In that moment, the facade they had maintained began to crumble, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath. The days turned into weeks. Their connection deepened. They shared stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They found solace in each other's presence, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. One night, as they lay in bed, Elena traced her fingers along Nathaniel's chest, her touch gentle and reassuring. Do you think we can make this work? She asked. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. I believe we already are. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment they found comfort in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Together, they faced the uncertainties of the future, their hearts intertwined in a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by love. It had been 3 months since the ceremony that had bound them together in contract, but every day since, something less measurable had begun to shift. Elena no longer saw Nathaniel only as the man across the conference table or the face of Coltec she was expected to stand beside. She saw the lines around his eyes when he laughed, the way he stood a little too still in elevators, the faint edge of sadness that clung to him when he spoke of his late father. She had stopped viewing him through the lens of duty. He was becoming a mystery she wanted to understand. It was late on a Thursday evening when their precarious balance tipped over into dangerous territory. The annual gala for Urban Futures was one of Chicago's most glamorous events, and for Nathaniel, it had always been a strategic performance, another opportunity to meet donors, investors, and media power players. But for Elena, it was her first major outing since whispers began to circulate in the press about how close the couple had become. The idea that strangers were tracking every glance, every touch made her skin prickle with discomfort. But that night, standing under the arched chandeliers of the Civic Opera House, she forgot the audience. Nathaniel had been waiting at the base of the staircase, his tuxedo cut sharply to frame his tall figure. His eyes had sought hers instantly when she entered, and for a split second, the air between them crackled with something unspoken. You're late, he said as she reached him. Blamed the reporters camped outside. One of them asked if I was the next Jacqueline Kennedy. His lips curved slightly. And what did you say? I said if I ever have to bury a man in office, I'll consider the comparison. He chuckled. Remind me not to run for mayor. They danced once that night, and only once, but it was enough. Enough for the cameras, enough to fuel another week of tabloid speculation. But for Elena, it was too much in an entirely different way. He held her close, not because he had to, but because something in him needed to. She felt it in the way his hand lingered at the small of her back, the way his breath warmed her temple. They didn't talk during the waltz. There was too much at risk in speaking. But as the last notes echoed through the hall, Nathaniel whispered, We need to stop pretending. Elena looked up at him. Pretending what? That this isn't real. That night, back at the penthouse, the tension between them finally snapped. They didn't plan it. It wasn't seduction. It was desperation. Two people who had held back for too long, suddenly letting go. Their clothes came off in a trail to the bedroom, not for sex alone, but for something far more revealing. Intimacy. When Nathaniel touched her, it wasn't possessive. It was reverent, like she was something fragile he never expected to hold. And when Elena looked into his eyes, she didn't see power or control. She saw a man terrified of needing someone. Again. Afterward, tangled in sheets and silence, Elena reached across the bed and touched his face gently. You're shaking, she whispered. He caught her hand in his. So are you. They didn't speak of love, not yet. But everything else in their bodies said it louder than words ever could. The next morning, she woke to find him gone. Panic rose briefly, but then she noticed a note on her pillow in his elegant handwriting. Breakfast on the balcony. I'll meet you there. When she joined him 20 minutes later, he was already seated with his tablet, 2 cups of coffee between them, and a spread of fresh croissants and berries. He glanced up as she approached, and something softened in his face. I wasn't sure if you'd come, he said. I wasn't sure if I'd find a note, she replied. They ate in a quiet rhythm, neither of them quite ready to name what had changed. That evening, Elena stood by the fireplace holding a glass of wine and watching the flames dance. Nathaniel entered the room, undoing his tie as he approached. We have a problem, he said, and her pulse leapt. What kind of problem? He handed her a file. Inside were printouts of a series of photos, a few blurry, some clearer. Paparazzi shots of them on the penthouse balcony, her hand resting on his shoulder, his fingers brushing her cheek. They'll run with this, he said. Make it into something. Her heart pounded. Isn't it already something? He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, yes, it is. And that's why we need to get ahead of it. By doing what? By deciding what story we want to tell. That was the night Elena realized they had reached a turning point, not just in public perception, but in their private choices. No matter how meticulously they had built this partnership on terms and timelines, reality had rewritten the rules. The following week, they sat side by side during an interview for Forbes. The journalist, savvy and polite, probed gently but persistently. So, she asked, how do two people with such storied professional lives manage to maintain a personal one? Nathaniel looked at Elena before answering. We don't manage it, we invest in it. Like any merger, successful or not, it depends on trust and transparency. The journalist smiled. A very corporate metaphor for a very romantic question. It's how we work, Elena replied with a confident grin. Romance through results. But behind the polished banter, their hands touched beneath the table. That night, the article's headline trended online. Cole and Ramirez, the power couple that wasn't supposed to be. They read it together in bed, legs tangled, the cities, heartbeat echoing through the windows. Do you think we're lying? Elena asked. Nathaniel shook his head. No, I think we're evolving. But not everything evolved as smoothly. 2 weeks later, during a board meeting at Coltech, tensions exploded. A misstep in a joint project with a European partner had triggered questions about decision-making within the executive branch. Elena had suggested a pivot strategy, one that contradicted Nathaniel's. The room had been tense. Elena could feel the heat of his disapproval even across the table. Afterward, she found him in his office, shoulders rigid, jaw set. You undermined me, he said. I offered a solution. In public. I'm not your assistant, Nathaniel. I'm your partner. That's not what it felt like in there. The argument had spiraled from there. He accused her of grandstanding. She accused him of insecurity. Voices rose, tempers flared, but somewhere in the middle of it, Elena stopped. This isn't about business, she said. You're afraid. Again, his silence was confirmation. You're afraid if you let me have too much say, you'll lose control. Just like you did before. His voice cracked. Because when I lost control last time, it cost me everything. And what do you think I'm trying to take from you? He stared at her for a long time. Nothing. But that doesn't mean I'm not still scared. She crossed the room and reached for his hand. Then let's be scared together. And for the first time, Nathaniel didn't pull away. That night, he told her about Caroline, the fiancé who had gutted his trust, sold internal data to competitors, and left with a settlement that nearly crushed Coltech's IPO. He told her about the humiliation, the therapy, the sleepless nights, and Elena, in turn, told him about her father, the empire builder who always made her feel like she had to earn his love through achievement. The years she spent convincing herself that love was a weakness. The walls she had built before Nathaniel ever walked into her life. By morning, they had shared more truths than either had with anyone else in years. By morning, they weren't afraid anymore. Not of each other. And for two people who had once sworn never to love again, that was the most dangerous, beautiful risk they'd ever taken. The days that followed were a delicate dance of proximity and distance. Nathaniel and Elena found themselves navigating a labyrinth of emotions, each step forward met with a cautious retreat. The walls they had meticulously built around their hearts began to show cracks, revealing glimpses of vulnerability they had long suppressed. One evening, as the city lights shimmered below, Elena stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Nathaniel joined her, a glass of scotch in hand. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Do you ever wonder what this could have been if we had met under different circumstances? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink, contemplating her question. I used to believe that timing was everything, that the right person at the wrong time was still the wrong person. But now I'm not so sure. Elena turned to face him, her eyes searching his. What changed? You, he admitted. You made me question everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about myself. Their gazes locked, the intensity of their emotions palpable. In that moment, the facade they had maintained began to crumble, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath us. The days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. They shared stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They found solace in each other's presence, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. One night, as they lay in bed, Eleanor traced her fingers along Nathaniel's chest, her touch gentle and reassuring. Do you think we can make this work? She asked. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. I believe we already are. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment they found comfort in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Together they faced the uncertainties of the future, their hearts intertwined in a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by love. The morning after the gala, something subtle but irreversible had changed between them. There was no declaration, no labels placed on what had occurred. But Elena could feel it in Nathaniel's silence as they shared breakfast on the penthouse terrace, and she could sense it in herself when his hand brushed hers while reaching for the coffee pot, and neither of them pulled away. The city below them buzzed with life as always, but their world had grown quieter, more tender, more intimate. They didn't talk about what they were becoming, not yet. Instead they worked, they strategized, they continued to perform the roles that had brought them together in the first place. Business allies, polished figures for public consumption, power players whose marriage was once transactional. But beneath that surface something deeper stirred, and then, like a match to dry tinder, the truth ignited. It began with a storm, not unlike the one that had chased them into each other's arms weeks ago. The sky above Chicago split with thunder. One Thursday afternoon, and by evening the penthouse windows trembled with rain. Nathaniel had been on calls all day, meetings with Hong Kong, updates from Berlin. Elena had spent her hours buried in research, preparing to pitch a new joint venture with a sustainable energy firm they had both shown interest in acquiring. When she walked into his office, he didn't look up. I need 5 minutes, she said. Not now, Elena. It's important. So is stabilizing our stock in the Asian markets. She paused, her frustration mounting. This isn't about stocks. It's about us. His head snapped up. Then it can wait. The words were sharper than he meant them, but the damage had been done. She stared at him, eyes wide, not with anger, but with disappointment. I see, she said finally, then turned and walked out. Nathaniel didn't follow. Not immediately. Not until the silence in her absence became louder than the storm outside. He found her in the library, sitting on the chaise with her arms wrapped around herself. Elena, he began, but she held up a hand. I thought we were past that. The deflection, the shutdown. I thought when you let me in, it meant something. It did, he said quietly. It does. Then why do I still feel like I'm standing on the outside of your life, waiting to be invited in? He sat beside her, not touching, but close enough to feel her pain like his own. I don't know how to be this, he confessed. With you, with anyone. I'm still learning. She turned to face him. So teach me too, but don't lock me out. That night they didn't make love. They simply held each other, and that somehow was even more intimate. The following week tested them in ways neither had anticipated. News broke that a rival tech conglomerate had made a bid for one of Coltech's most lucrative patents. The board demanded answers. Investors panicked. And in the chaos, Nathaniel's old habits returned. Control, authority, isolation. Elena watched him retreat into himself and made a choice. She stepped into the boardroom uninvited during an emergency strategy meeting. Gentlemen, she said, calm and precise. If you continue to try solving this crisis without the full perspective of your executive council, you're not just wasting time. You're risking everything we've built. Some of the older board members looked taken aback. A few even tried to challenge her authority. But Nathaniel didn't. He looked up at her, and for the first time in weeks, there was something like pride in his eyes. After the meeting, he pulled her aside. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did, she replied. Because I won't let you fall on this alone. He touched her face gently. You never let me fall. That night, in the privacy of their penthouse, they finally talked, not about business, not about image, but about fear. I was engaged once before, Elena confessed, to a man who said all the right things. But I realized too late, he loved the idea of me. Not the woman with ambition, with fire, just the accessory. Nathaniel listened, his hand wrapped around hers. I thought I couldn't trust anyone. After Caroline, he said. Then you came into my life and made me want to try again. So let's try, she whispered. Together. For a time it worked. They became partners in the truest sense. Co-leaders, co-dreamers. They brought their companies closer, presented a united front at conferences, and quietly began building something like a life. But love, as it turned out, didn't ask for permission to complicate things. One evening, while preparing for a retreat with Coltech's European partners, Elena found a file on Nathaniel's desk. It was marked Contingency Acquisition, Ramirez Holdings. Her name. Her company. Without a word, she took the folder and confronted him. What is this? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. It's just a precaution. You made plans to acquire my company without telling me? It's not like that. Then, explain it. He tried, fumbling with language that failed to disguise what the document revealed. At some point, he had considered what it would look like if she walked away, if she left him, if the arrangement dissolved. You thought I'd betray you, she said, the hurt in her voice undeniable. I didn't want to be caught off guard again. I'm not Caroline. I know, he whispered, but sometimes I forget that not everyone leaves. She stared at him, eyes brimming. You still don't trust me. I'm trying. But not enough. She left that night. Not because she didn't love him, but because she needed to remember who she was when she wasn't defined by him. 3 days passed. Nathaniel barely slept. He cancelled meetings, ignored calls. The penthouse felt colder without her, quieter in a way that gnawed at him. On the 4th day, he found himself outside her childhood home in Lincoln Park, the address she had once mentioned in passing. She opened the door before he could knock. You came, she said softly. He stepped inside, soaked from the rain. I made a mistake, he said. I let fear speak louder than love. Elena studied him for a long moment, then reached for his hand. Then let's choose love again, she said. Together. And he knew right then he would never let fear lead him again. The days that followed were a delicate dance of proximity and distance. Nathaniel and Elena found themselves navigating a labyrinth of emotions, each step forward, met with a cautious retreat. The walls they had meticulously built around their hearts began to show cracks, revealing glimpses of vulnerability they had long suppressed. One evening, as the city lights shimmered below, Elena stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Nathaniel joined her, a glass of scotch in hand. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Do you ever wonder what this could have been if we had met under different circumstances? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink, contemplating her question. I used to believe that timing was everything, that the right person at the wrong time was still the wrong person. But now I'm not so sure. Elena turned to face him, her eyes searching his. What changed? You, he admitted. You made me question everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about myself. Their gazes locked, the intensity of their emotions palpable. In that moment, the facade they had maintained began to crumble, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath. The days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. They shared stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They found solace in each other's presence, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. One night, as they lay in bed, Elena traced her fingers along Nathaniel's chest, her touch, gentle and reassuring. Do you think we can make this work? She asked. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. I believe we already are. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment they found comfort in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Together they faced the uncertainties of the future, their hearts intertwined in a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by love. Their reconciliation after the misunderstanding over the acquisition file had done more than mend a crack. In their growing relationship, it had reshaped the foundation itself. Nathaniel and Elena were no longer simply navigating a shared existence, they were building one. Slowly, carefully, deliberately. But love, as they were learning, was less about avoiding storms and more about choosing who you'd rather be drenched beside when the lightning came. The first real test of that new bond didn't arrive with malice. It came with an email. It was from Caroline. Nathaniel didn't tell Elena right away, not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't know what to make of it. The subject line had been simple. 5 minutes of honesty. The body of the message even simpler. If you want closure, meet me. You choose the time, you choose the place. He stared at it for hours. Finally, he closed his laptop and found Elena in the kitchen, barefoot, hair messy from sleep, making late-night tea with a playlist humming low in the background. Something about her presence, the ease of it, the way she looked at him with complete certainty, made the conflict in his chest not tighter. "Can we talk?" he said. She turned instantly alert. "Of course, what is it?" She reached out. Elena didn't ask who. She knew. And she wants to meet. He expected anger, maybe suspicion. But all Elena did was tilt her head, eyes steady. "Do you want to?" Nathaniel's throat tightened. "No," he admitted. "But I think I need to." "Then you should." That was it. No accusations, no possessiveness. Just trust, pure and rare. The next afternoon, he met Caroline at a quiet rooftop cafe overlooking the river. The years had aged her well, but her presence no longer stirred anything in him. Where once he'd felt longing or rage, now there was only detachment. She wore a blazer too expensive for someone whose reputation had been decimated, and her tone was as clipped as ever. "I came to say I'm sorry," she said without preamble. "I don't need your apology. You deserve it anyway." He waited. "I ruined you," she continued. "Not just professionally. I broke something in you I never had the right to touch. I wanted power, and I used love to get it." Nathaniel said nothing. "I followed your progress. Your wife is impressive. She's not my wife by convenience anymore." "I figured as much." Caroline gave a bitter smile. "I just wanted to say it. That I was wrong. That maybe if I'd been someone else, you could have become the man you are. Now a lot sooner. You don't get to take credit for that." "No," she agreed softly. "But I do get to say goodbye." And with that, she stood and left. Nathaniel returned home, not relieved, but strangely peaceful. He found Elena in the garden balcony, a book on her lap, her glasses slipping down her nose. He slipped beside her, rested his head against her shoulder, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 5 years. "She's not a ghost anymore," he said. Elena closed her book and wrapped her arms around him. "Then maybe now you're finally free." In the weeks that followed, they lived in a quiet rhythm. Morning coffees turned into long conversations. Business meetings morphed into opportunities to challenge and support one another. They no longer pretended not to care. The whole city knew now. Elena Ramirez and Nathaniel Cole were no longer bound by strategic alliances or contractual marriages. They were in love. And then came the news. They were seated in the executive lounge of O'Hare International Airport, waiting for a flight to Geneva, where Elena had been invited to speak at a global sustainability summit. Nathaniel was scrolling through messages when his face stilled. Elena leaned in. "What's wrong?" He handed her the screen. It was an article from the Wall Street Journal. Ramirez Holdings targeted in backdoor buyout attempt. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. "What? How?" "I don't know," Nathaniel said, already making calls. "But I promise you, we're not letting them take it." In Geneva, Elena delivered the keynote address flawlessly, but the fire in her eyes wasn't only passion for clean energy anymore. It was war. She returned to Chicago 2 days later, stepped off the plane, and walked straight into her war room. Within 72 hours, they had traced the buyout attempt to a masked fund with ties to Ocelot Tech, a shadowy conglomerate infamous for hostile takeovers. "This is retaliation," Elena muttered, "for the energy merger we pulled off last year." Nathaniel sat beside her, jaw tense. "They think if they destabilize your company, they destabilize us." "They're not wrong," she admitted. "Then we fight," and fight they did. Their days blurred into strategy meetings, legal briefs, press countermeasures, and back-channel negotiations. At night, they collapsed into each other, too tired to talk but unwilling to sleep apart. The pressure mounted, and for the first time, Elena saw in Nathaniel not just the man she loved, but the warrior she had once underestimated. He was fierce in his loyalty, unrelenting in his pursuit of justice. But it wasn't until she walked into the boardroom at Ramirez Holdings and saw her father seated at the head of the table that she realized how much the battle would cost. "Dad," she whispered. "Sweetheart," he replied, rising. They hadn't spoken in nearly a year. Heard about the attack, he said, his voice gruff. I thought it was time I stopped watching from the sidelines. Later, after the meeting, she found Nathaniel outside watching the city lights. You called him, she said. He nodded. I thought you'd hate me for it. I could never hate you for giving me my father back. He turned, surprised by her tears. You're the only man I've ever trusted to hold my heart, she said. And now you've protected my legacy too. Nathaniel pulled her into his arms. Because your legacy is my future. That night they didn't sleep. They talked about everything, about merging their companies under a single vision, about building a new foundation for their family, about children maybe one day and where they'd raise them. And for the first time they didn't talk about when it would all fall apart. They talked about how they'd hold it together. They talked about forever. The days that followed were a delicate dance of proximity and distance. Nathaniel and Eleanor found themselves navigating a labyrinth of emotions. Each step forward met with a cautious retreat. The walls they had meticulously built around their hearts began to show cracks, revealing glimpses of vulnerability they had long suppressed. One evening, as the city lights shimmered below, Eleanor stood on the balcony, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Nathaniel joined her, a glass of scotch in hand. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily between them. Do you ever wonder what this could have been if we had met under different circumstances? Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel took a sip of his drink, contemplating her question. I used to believe that timing was everything, that the right person at the wrong time was still the wrong person. But now I'm not so sure. Elena turned to face him, her eyes searching his. What changed? You, he admitted. You made me question everything I thought I knew about love, about trust, about myself. Their gazes locked, the intensity of their emotions palpable. In that moment, the facade they had maintained began to crumble, revealing the raw, unfiltered truth beneath. As the days turned into weeks, their connection deepened. They shared stories of their pasts, their fears, their dreams. They found solace in each other's presence, a sanctuary from the chaos of the world outside. One night, as they lay in bed, Eleanor traced her fingers along Nathaniel's chest, her touch, gentle and reassuring. Do you think we can make this work? She asked. Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes filled with sincerity. I believe we already are. Their journey was far from over, but in that moment they found comfort in the knowledge that they were no longer alone. Together they faced the uncertainties of the future, their hearts intertwined in a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by love. Elena and Nathaniel had survived the storm. The acquisition threat had been neutralized, their companies remained intact, stronger for having weathered the attack. But more importantly, so had they. Yet it was never about simply surviving. For two people who had started their journey in the domain of transaction and pretense, survival wasn't the destination. It was the threshold. Now came the harder part, choosing how to live on the other side of victory. The decision came quietly. 1. Morning. After a night spent wrapped in each other's arms, Elena woke before Nathaniel. The first rays of sunlight bathed the penthouse in a golden hush, catching on the angular lines of his face as he slept. She traced them gently with her eyes, the barely there scar at the edge of his temple from a skiing accident he'd once told her about, the way his lashes fanned against his cheekbone, softer in rest than they ever were in war. She got up, retrieved her laptop and began typing. It wasn't a business plan or a legal memo. It was a letter. To him, Nathaniel, they say. Love is the opposite of fear, but I don't think that's true. I think love is what teaches you to live with fear, not banish it. Loving you hasn't made me fearless. It's made me braver. Every time I look at you, I see the man you are, but also the man you keep trying to hide, the boy who was abandoned, the partner who was betrayed, the billionaire who told the world love didn't matter. I see him, Nathaniel, and I love him too. You never had to fall in love with me, but you did. You broke every vow you made to protect your heart and gave it to me instead. I want to build something new with you, not just a company, a life. So if you're still willing to risk it all, meet me tonight. She printed the letter, folded it once, and left it on the pillow beside him. Then she disappeared for the day. Nathaniel read the letter when he awoke. He read it again an hour later, and again in the quiet stretch of late afternoon when work couldn't distract him. At precisely 7 p.m., he arrived at the address she had scrawled at the bottom, a small restored chapel in Lincoln Park, tucked between a bookstore and a florist. This interior was lit only by candlelight. Elena stood at the altar in a gown of simple ivory silk. There were no guests, no photographers, no press releases, just them. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her heart thundering in her chest. "You came," she said, breathless. "I always would," he replied. "Especially for you." In his hand was a ring, not the one he had given her for their business merger, but something new, something real. "I don't have a best man," he said with a smile. She smiled back. "I don't have bridesmaids either." "Good. Then there's nothing between us and forever." They didn't need a priest. They didn't need rehearsed vows. They stood in the light of flickering candles, and with trembling voices and eyes full of tears, they said everything that had once gone unsaid. "I take you," he said, "not for the benefit of a corporation, but because my heart refuses to belong to anyone else. And I take you," she whispered, "not because it makes sense on paper, but because you are the most honest truth I've ever known." They slipped the rings on each other's fingers. Then they kissed, not to seal a deal, not for the sake of the public image, but because they couldn't not. Later that night, they returned to the penthouse barefoot, laughing, their formal clothes rumpled and their eyes glowing. They danced in the living room to a jazz record she had forgotten she owned, her heels kicked aside, his tie long since abandoned. And then, as the music faded, Nathaniel took her hand and led her to the rooftop garden, the place where she'd once waited for him in the rain, unsure if he would ever choose her fully. Now beneath the stars, with the city lights shimmering below and the future stretching wide before them, he knelt. "I know we just did this," he said, holding out a key instead of another ring. "But this is for our house, the one I bought in Aspen, the one I want to build a family in, filled with late mornings and burnt toast and love." Elena took the key, her fingers closing around it with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. "We'll still argue," she said, her voice thick. "We'll still scare each other, challenge each other, but never leave," he finished. She nodded. Never. They made love that night with every light in the room on. No shadows, no hiding. And in the months that followed, they didn't retreat from the world. They reintroduced themselves to it. Not as a merger, not as a brand, but as a story about love reborn. Nathaniel Cole, the billionaire who had sworn never to love, again became the keynote speaker at a philanthropy conference titled Second Chances. He told the story of losing everything, of rebuilding, not just an empire, but a heart. Elena Ramirez launched a mentoring program for young women in tech, funded personally by the Cole Ramirez Foundation. She told them about her failures, her heartbreaks, and the love that made her stronger. Not softer, stronger. They weren't perfect, but they were perfectly aligned. And maybe in a world full of polished photos and scripted romances, that was the most beautiful thing of all. Years later, as they stood hand in hand on a beach in southern Italy, their two children racing through the sand ahead of them, Nathaniel kissed the top of Elena's head and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" she asked, smiling. "For making me break every promise I made, and making me glad I did." She leaned into him, her heart still catching at the sound of his voice, even after all that time. "Some promises," she said, "are meant to be broken, and others they both knew were meant to last forever." The end. Just when it seemed like the world had settled, when their hearts had finally aligned and the ghosts of the past lay quiet, the storm returned. Only this time it wore a new face. It began with a letter, slid beneath the door of their Aspen home. Elena found it first arriving back from a morning hike with their son. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but what she read inside turned her blood to ice. By the time Nathaniel returned home from a call with investors, he found her standing in the kitchen, pale and trembling. "Elena?" She handed him the letter. He read it once, then again, and the world shifted under his feet. "To whom it may concern, you don't know me, but I knew Nathaniel once, intimately. I was never supposed to speak, but now I'm dying, and truth matters more than fear. Your husband has a daughter he doesn't know exists. She's 12. Her name is Isla, and she looks exactly like him." The signature was illegible. No contact details, nothing but a tremor of history resurfacing without warning. Elena spoke first. "Tell me this isn't true." Nathaniel opened his mouth, closed it, then forced himself to speak. "Before Caroline, before any of this, there was someone. Her name was Dani. We were young. It didn't end badly. We just went separate ways. She left the country. I haven't heard from her in over a decade. And you never thought to follow up? There was nothing to follow up. We were casual. She was clear about not wanting anything serious. Eleanor turned away, fury and fear twisting in her chest. A child, Nathaniel. You might have a daughter and you didn't know. Didn't know, he said again, his voice cracking. She stood in silence for a long moment, her back to him. Then without another word, she picked up the letter and walked out of the room. The next days were cold, suspended between disbelief and aching silence. Eleanor wasn't angry that he had a past, everyone did. What shook her was how the future they were building suddenly felt less certain, infiltrated by something uncontrollable. It took Nathaniel 5 days to find a trace. Danny had passed 6 months ago in London. Cancer. No surviving family. But the name listed on her death record, Isla Grace Madden, was real. He booked a flight to London without consulting Eleanor, leaving only a note that said, I have to know. When he met Isla, the world stopped. She had his eyes. She was shy, fiercely intelligent, guarded. She'd been living in a group home since her mother passed, unaware of who her father was. Danny had left no instructions, no paperwork, no will. Only a letter meant to be delivered if she died. Somehow, it had reached them. Nathaniel stayed for a week, watching Isla from a distance at first, then slowly introducing himself as someone who had known her mother. When he finally told her the truth, she didn't cry. She simply asked, why did she keep you a secret? And he had no answer. When he returned to Aspen with Isla by his side, Eleanor was waiting. This is Isla, Nathaniel said, his voice filled with awe and terror. She's mine. Eleanor knelt before the girl, her hands trembling as she brushed a strand of dark hair from Isla's cheek. Hi, she whispered. I'm Eleanor. I've been waiting to meet you. It didn't happen overnight, but Isla slowly found her place in the home Elena and Nathaniel had built. There were awkward moments where grief and guilt and resentment stirred the air like dust, but also moments of laughter, of newfound joy. Eleanor didn't just embrace the girl. She made her feel chosen, not just accepted. For Nathaniel, it was a reckoning. He'd spent his life building walls to protect himself. But love, real love, was messy, unexpected, and often came wrapped in challenges you never saw coming. That spring, as the three of them stood together in the garden, Eleanor, Nathaniel, and Isla watching the sunrise over the mountains, he knew what he had once believed was impossible. Love didn't just heal. It rebuilt. Stronger, wiser, whole. Thank you so much for joining us on this unforgettable journey of love, transformation, and second chances. If you felt moved by Nathaniel and Elena's story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating rich, emotional stories that inspire, heal, and captivate. Stay tuned for more heart-tugging tales, and remember, love always finds a way.